October 15, 1942, 6:30 a.m., Chelyabinsk Oblast, Soviet Union, Reserve Rifle Regiment Training Depot. Mansur Abdulin stepped off a transport train into air that smelled of coal smoke from the locomotive, unwashed bodies from the men who had traveled with him for 3 days, and the particular mustiness of wooden barracks whose construction had been completed only weeks before the conscripts arrived to fill them. The sound that greeted him was not screaming drill instructors, but the quieter noise of administrative processing, clerks calling names from lists, sergeants directing groups toward buildings whose purpose would become clear only when the groups entered them. Abdulin was 24 years old, a former collective farm worker from a Tatar village in Bashkiria, whose education had ended when agricultural labor demanded his full attention, and whose experience of the world beyond his village had been limited to the regional center, where he had occasionally traveled for supplies. He had been conscripted in September, had spent weeks in transit through a mobilization system whose scale exceeded anything his village existence had prepared him to comprehend, had arrived at a training depot whose purpose was transforming peasants into soldiers through a process whose duration the war's demands had compressed beyond what effective transformation required. The rifle issued to him that first morning was a Mosin Nagant, a bolt-action weapon whose design dated to 1891 and whose operation he would learn through familiarization exercises that allocated fewer than 20 rounds of live ammunition per trainee. The rifle smelled of cosmoline preservative and the metal oil that armorers had applied before distribution, scents that would become familiar through the weeks ahead as Abdulin learned to disassemble, clean, and reassemble a weapon whose functioning he would master theoretically before he mastered it practically. The theoretical mastery would have to suffice. Ammunition was needed at the front. Training depots received what the front could spare, which was almost nothing. 6 weeks, the duration of his preparation for combat that had already consumed millions of Soviet soldiers, would be measured in 6 weeks, a timeline that reflected not pedagogical assessment of what infantry training required, but logistical calculation of what the front demanded and how quickly those demands could be met. The German advance had been stopped at Moscow the previous winter, but Stalingrad was now consuming divisions faster than the mobilization system could produce them. Every day that Abdulin spent in training was a day that his eventual unit fought without the replacement it needed. The arithmetic that governed his preparation was not the arithmetic of learning, but the arithmetic of bodies, the calculation of how many men could be processed through how many depots in how little time. The training depot's curriculum had been designed for circumstances that no longer existed, for a peacetime army whose preparation could extend across months rather than weeks, whose soldiers could master skills through repetition that abbreviated schedules could not accommodate. The curriculum had been compressed rather than redesigned, its components shortened proportionally without consideration of which components required full duration and which could tolerate reduction. Rifle familiarization that should have consumed 3 weeks was compressed into 1. Tactical training that should have included live fire exercises was conducted with wooden markers and verbal descriptions of what ammunition would do if ammunition were available. Political instruction retained its full allocation because political instruction's importance did not diminish regardless of what other subjects suffered. Abdulin learned to march in formations whose purpose he understood abstractly and would experience concretely only when German artillery demonstrated what concentrated targets meant. He learned to dig fighting positions whose depth and construction his instructors described, but whose adequacy he could not evaluate until German fire tested positions he had dug under conditions that training had not replicated. He learned the theory of infantry tactics through lectures delivered by sergeants whose combat experience was genuine, but whose ability to convey that experience through verbal instruction was limited by the time available and the number of trainees requiring instruction. 15 million Soviet soldiers would receive similar preparation during the course of the war, men whose training was measured in weeks because the front could not wait for training measured in months. The preparation they received was not worthless, it was merely insufficient, a foundation whose inadequacy became apparent only when the structure built upon it encountered stresses that adequate foundations might have withstood. December 3, 1943, 5:45 a.m. Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego, California. Eugene Sledge stepped off a bus into darkness that smelled of the Pacific Ocean, diesel exhaust, and something else beneath those familiar odors, the sweat of generations of recruits who had made this same journey, absorbed into the asphalt and wooden buildings of a place designed to dismantle civilians and rebuild them into something their former selves would not have recognized. The sound that greeted him was screaming, drill instructors whose voices had been trained to produce frequencies that bypassed rational thought and triggered responses that rationality would have rejected. Sledge was 20 years old, the son of a physician from Mobile, Alabama, whose comfortable upbringing had included expectations of education and professional achievement that military service had interrupted. He had attended Marion Military Institute, had begun studies at Georgia Tech, had abandoned academics when the war made classroom attendance seem irrelevant, while contemporaries were fighting and dying in places whose names he had learned from newspapers rather than textbooks. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps against his father's wishes, choosing the service whose reputation for demanding preparation matched his understanding of what the war required. The 8 weeks that began that December morning would constitute only the first phase of training whose total duration would exceed 13 months before Sledge experienced combat. The Marine Corps had designed its preparation programs around assumptions that differed fundamentally from the assumptions governing Soviet training, assumptions that soldiers were investments whose protection justified the time that protection required, that skills properly learned would be retained under stress, while skills inadequately learned would evaporate when stress arrived, that the institution's reputation depended on the performance of the men it produced, and that performance depended on preparation whose adequacy could not be compromised by schedules that urgency imposed. Boot camp's purpose was transformation so complete that the men who emerged bore only superficial resemblance to the men who had entered. The transformation was physical, forced marches that extended beyond what civilian bodies believed possible, calisthenics whose repetition rebuilt musculature that civilian life had allowed to atrophy, obstacle courses whose completion required strength that completion itself developed. The transformation was psychological, the systematic destruction of civilian identity through stress that revealed weakness, followed by the reconstruction of military identity through repetition that replaced weakness with capability. The transformation was cultural, the installation of values that prioritized unit cohesion over individual survival, that made the Marine beside you more important than the Marine you saw in mirrors. Sledge learned to fire the M1 Garand rifle through progression that moved from classroom instruction to dry firing to live ammunition exercises whose consumption of rounds would have seemed extravagant to Soviet training officers whose allocations permitted fewer than 20 shots per conscript. He fired hundreds of rounds during qualification alone, developing the muscle memory that accurate shooting required through repetition that abbreviated training could not provide. The rifle became an extension of his body rather than an implement his body carried, a relationship whose development required time that the Marine Corps had decided its recruits deserved. The investment that boot camp represented was visible in facilities whose construction and maintenance consumed resources that combat operations might otherwise have claimed. It was visible in the ratio of instructors to recruits, numbers that permitted individual attention whose absence would have degraded the training's effectiveness. It was visible in the curriculum itself. 8 weeks of full-time instruction whose content had been refined through decades of institutional experience into sequences that built capabilities in orders that capability building required. 6,000 miles to the east, Mansur Abdulin had completed his 6 weeks of training and was now approaching Stalingrad through a replacement system whose efficiency was measured in bodies delivered rather than soldiers prepared. The contrast between his preparation and Sledge's existed beyond either man's awareness, beyond the information that either army shared with soldiers whose concerns were immediate survival rather than comparative institutional analysis. But the contrast was real, embedded in the systems that had produced them, and the consequences of that contrast would be measured in survival rates whose divergence reflected everything the training time had revealed about what each nation believed a soldier's life was worth. March 9, 1942, 2:15 p.m., Washington, D.C., Army Ground Forces Headquarters, Army War College Building. Lieutenant General Lesley James McNair reviewed training schedules whose implementation would determine whether the United States Army that eventually met German forces in combat would be capable of defeating them. His office smelled of pipe tobacco, paper that had accumulated in stacks whose organization reflected priorities rather than chronology, and the particular staleness of a building whose ventilation was designed for peacetime occupancy rather than wartime intensity that now filled its corridors with officers whose urgency exceeded what architecture could accommodate. McNair was 59 years old, a former artilleryman from Verndale, Minnesota, whose career had traced the transformation of American military capability from the frontier constabulary that had fought Spain to the industrial army that had fought Germany in 1918 and would fight Germany again in circumstances whose scale dwarfed anything the previous war had demanded. He had been wounded in France, had spent the interwar years in assignments that combined operational command with institutional development, had emerged as the officer whose understanding of training systems exceeded anyone else's in an army that would need to train millions of civilians whose civilian backgrounds had prepared them for nothing that combat would require. The task before him was unprecedented in American military history: the creation of training programs capable of transforming 8 million civilians into soldiers whose competence would match or exceed the professional armies they would face. The German Wehrmacht had been built through years of preparation, its officers and non-commissioned officers products of institutional cultures whose development had required generations. The American Army would have to compress that development into months, would have to produce in accelerated time frames capabilities that traditional methods required years to develop. The compression could not be achieved by simply shortening existing programs. It required fundamental reconception of how training worked and what training was supposed to accomplish. McNair's philosophy centered on a single principle whose application would distinguish American preparation from the abbreviated processing that Soviet training depots performed. Stress revealed truth. A soldier who had mastered skills in classroom conditions might lose those skills entirely when stress arrived. A soldier who had mastered skills under stress would retain them when stress intensified. Training that did not include stress was not training at all, but merely familiarization, the creation of knowledge that would evaporate precisely when knowledge mattered most. Real training required real stress, conditions that approximated combat closely enough that soldiers who succeeded in training would succeed in combat, and soldiers who failed in training would fail before their failure killed the men beside them. The implementation of this philosophy produced training exercises whose realism exceeded anything previous American military preparation had attempted. Live ammunition was fired over the heads of advancing infantry, close enough that the sounds and sensations of bullets passing nearby became familiar before those sounds and sensations were produced by enemies whose aim was lethal rather than instructional. Forced marches extended beyond distances that peacetime standards would have permitted, building endurance that combat would require through demands that peacetime caution would have prohibited. Casualties occurred during training, men killed or wounded by the realistic conditions that McNair insisted preparation required. The casualties produced criticism whose intensity McNair absorbed without modifying methods whose necessity he understood better than his critics did. A training death was tragedy. A combat death caused by inadequate training was tragedy compounded by institutional failure, a death that proper preparation might have prevented. The calculus was cold but accurate. Men who died in training because training was realistic were fewer than men who would die in combat because training had been gentle. The investment in realistic preparation was an investment in survival, a commitment to soldiers' lives that manifested through apparent disregard for their comfort. The system McNair built processed millions of men through programs whose duration and intensity reflected institutional commitment that Soviet training could not replicate. A rifleman received 17 weeks of basic and advanced individual training. Specialized skills required additional weeks whose allocation depended on the complexity of the skills being developed. The total investment in each soldier represented resources that the Soviet system directed toward production of equipment rather than preparation of the men who would operate it. The training that Mansur Abdulin received during his 6 weeks near Chelyabinsk bore no resemblance to the systematic preparation that McNair was constructing 6,000 miles away. His days began before dawn in barracks whose smell had become familiar through repetition. Wood smoke from stoves whose inadequacy left corners of the building frozen, the accumulated odor of men whose bathing opportunities were limited to weekly visits to facilities that could not accommodate the numbers requiring them, the particular staleness of clothing that was worn continuously because replacement clothing did not exist in quantities that replacement would have required. The curriculum that governed his preparation had been designed by officers whose understanding of infantry combat derived from the previous war, whose assumptions about what soldiers needed to know had been formed before mechanized warfare transformed everything those assumptions addressed. Rifle familiarization consumed the largest portion of instructional time, hours devoted to the Mosin-Nagant's operation that would have been adequate if operation were the only skill that rifles required. Abdulin learned to load, aim, fire, clear malfunctions, and maintain the weapon through cleaning procedures whose thoroughness would preserve function in conditions that dirt and moisture would otherwise degrade. The instruction was competent. The ammunition that would have transformed instruction into skill was absent. He fired his rifle 17 times during the entire 6 weeks of training, each round representing an allocation whose scarcity reflected priorities that placed production above preparation. The 17 rounds were sufficient to verify that he understood the rifle's operation, that he could hit targets at ranges that combat would rarely permit, that the theoretical knowledge classroom instruction had provided corresponded to practical capability that live firing confirmed. The 17 rounds were not sufficient to develop the automatic responses that effective rifle use required, the muscle memory that permitted aiming and firing without conscious thought, the relationship between shooter and weapon that extensive practice created and abbreviated practice could not replicate. Tactical instruction occupied hours whose content Abdulin absorbed without the experiential reinforcement that would have made absorption meaningful. He learned that infantry should advance in dispersed formations rather than concentrated masses, that cover should be sought when enemy fire was received, that fire and movement should be coordinated so that some elements provided suppression while other elements advanced. The knowledge existed in his mind as information rather than capability, concepts that he could recite but could not execute, because execution required practice that the training schedule did not include. He had never experienced advancing while live ammunition passed nearby. He had never coordinated with other soldiers under fire, never treated a wound, never experienced the cold that Stalingrad's winter would impose on men whose equipment was inadequate, and whose preparation was incomplete. 15 million Soviet soldiers received similar preparation during the war, men processed through depots whose curricula had been compressed beyond what effective training required, whose duration reflected logistics rather than pedagogy, whose graduates arrived at the front knowing how rifles operated, but not how survival worked. The training that Eugene Sledge received after boot camp extended through months whose accumulation represented investment that Soviet conscripts could not have imagined. He departed San Diego in February 1944, traveling to Camp Elliott for advanced infantry training, whose curriculum built upon the foundation that boot camp had established. The camp smelled of chaparral and dust, the particular dryness of Southern California landscape that would seem alien to a young man from the humid Gulf Coast, but that provided terrain whose demands developed capabilities that humid terrain would also require. Advanced infantry training consumed additional weeks whose content moved beyond individual skills toward collective capabilities that combat would demand. Sledge learned to operate within squads whose coordination determined whether firepower was concentrated effectively or dispersed uselessly, whether movement exposed men to enemy fire or used terrain to minimize exposure, whether the 12 men who comprised the unit functioned as a single organism or as 12 individuals whose individual efforts could not accomplish what coordination might achieve. The training included live fire exercises, whose realism would have seemed extravagant to instructors at Chelyabinsk, ammunition expended to develop skills rather than hoarded for combat that skills might not survive to reach. He learned weapons beyond the rifle that boot camp had emphasized, the Browning automatic rifle, whose 20-round magazine provided sustained fire that bolt-action rifles could not match, the light machine gun, whose tripod mounting permitted accuracy at ranges that handheld weapons could not achieve, the grenades whose employment required judgment about distance and timing that only practice could develop. Each weapon system received hours of instruction, whose purpose was not merely familiarization, but mastery, the development of capabilities that would persist under stress, because they had been developed through repetition that stress could not erase. The mortar training that followed advanced infantry school represented specialization whose depth illustrated everything that distinguished American preparation from Soviet processing. Sledge was assigned to a 60mm mortar squad, a weapon system whose effective operation required skills that weeks of dedicated instruction would develop. The mortar smelled of gun oil and the particular metallic odor of machined steel, whose precision determined whether rounds landed where gunners intended or scattered across areas whose width made the weapon useless. He learned to assemble the weapon from components whose weight he memorized through handling, to calculate ranges through methods that combined mathematical formula with experiential adjustment, to adjust fire based on observation whose interpretation required practice that only practice could provide. The 60mm mortar was not a complicated weapon. Its operation could be explained in hours. Its effective employment required weeks because effectiveness depended on skills whose development could not be compressed regardless of how clearly the skills were described. Sledge learned to drop rounds down the tube at rates that sustained fire required, to adjust elevation and traverse with precision that accuracy demanded, to coordinate with forward observers whose reports would guide fire onto targets that mortar crews could not see. Each skill built upon previous skills in sequences whose order mattered because foundations had to exist before structures could be built upon them. By the time Sledge departed for the Pacific in September 1944, he had spent 13 months in preparation whose phases had accumulated capabilities that combat would test and validate. He had fired thousands of rounds through weapons whose operation had become automatic. He had practiced tactical movements until those movements required no conscious thought. He had learned to function within units whose coordination had been developed through exercises that replicated the stress coordination would face. The investment that 13 months represented was visible in the Marine who boarded the transport ship, a man whose physical conditioning, technical skills, and psychological preparation had been developed through time that the Marine Corps had decided he deserved. Mansur Abdulin had received 6 weeks. The disparity was not a matter of institutional preference or cultural difference. It was a matter of what each system believed soldiers were worth, whether soldiers were assets whose protection justified investment or ammunition whose expenditure was simply the cost of operations that expenditure enabled. The training time revealed the answer that each system had provided to a question whose asking would have seemed strange to the men who lived the answers without ever articulating the question. Sledge's 13 months said he mattered. Abdulin's 6 weeks said he did not. July 25, 1944, 11:52 a.m. Normandy, France, near the village of Ebbe-Crevant. Lieutenant General Lesley James McNair crouched in a foxhole approximately 800 yards behind the front lines, waiting for the air bombardment that would initiate Operation Cobra, the breakout from the hedgerow country that had contained American forces since the D-Day landings 7 weeks earlier. The air smelled of French farmland, diesel exhaust from vehicles positioned nearby, and the particular tension that accumulated in spaces where men waited for events whose outcome they could not control. He had traveled to Normandy to observe the soldiers his training system had produced, to see whether the methods he had designed and the programs he had implemented had created an army capable of defeating the Wehrmacht in conditions training had attempted to replicate. McNair was 61 years old now, the architect of American military preparation whose work had processed 8 million men through programs whose realism he had insisted upon, despite criticism that realism produced. He wore the single star of a brigadier general rather than the 3 stars his actual rank warranted, a deception designed to conceal his presence from German intelligence whose knowledge that the commander of Army ground forces was observing from forward positions might have produced responses that concealment could prevent. The deception was standard operational security. It would prove irrelevant to what happened next. The bombers appeared at noon, 1,500 B-17s and B-24s, whose payload would fall on German positions preparatory to the ground assault that would follow. The aircraft approached from the north, flying parallel to the front lines along routes that bombardiers had been briefed to follow, releasing their bombs on coordinates that should have placed explosives on German defenders rather than American observers. The system that directed 1,500 aircraft toward targets whose proximity to friendly forces was measured in hundreds of yards required precision that the system could not guarantee. Bombs fell short. They fell on American positions. They fell on the foxhole where Lesley McNair waited to observe what his training system had accomplished. The explosion that killed him was American. Ordnance manufactured in American factories, loaded into American aircraft, released by American bombardiers whose error was the kind of error that complex operations produced, regardless of how carefully those operations were planned. The irony was absolute. The man who had insisted that training must include realistic danger, who had accepted training casualties as the cost of preparation that might prevent combat casualties, was killed by friendly fire during an operation whose success would validate everything his training system had achieved. He had built an army capable of defeating Germany. He did not survive to see that army complete the victory his preparation had made possible. His body was recovered from the crater that the bomb had created, identified through personal effects that the explosion had not destroyed, and buried initially in Normandy before being returned to the United States for internment at a location whose disclosure was delayed to preserve the deception his reduced insignia had been designed to maintain. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action during the war, though the action that killed him was not enemy action at all, but the consequence of operational complexity whose management exceeded what perfection could achieve. 6,000 miles to the east, Soviet soldiers continued arriving at fronts whose demands had not diminished despite 3 years of war whose casualties exceeded anything American operations would produce. The system that McNair had built was producing soldiers whose performance in Normandy would demonstrate what thorough preparation accomplished. The system that Soviet necessity had imposed was producing soldiers whose performance demonstrated what abbreviated preparation cost. The breakout that Operation Cobra achieved validated McNair's methods through results whose decisiveness exceeded what planners had anticipated. American forces poured through gaps that the bombing had created, exploiting the disruption that air power had produced with ground maneuvers whose execution reflected training that hedgerow fighting had tested and confirmed. The soldiers who achieved this breakout had been prepared through programs McNair had designed, had developed capabilities through curricula McNair had approved, had become the army that McNair had envisioned through methods that McNair had not survived to see succeed. Mansur Abdulin survived Stalingrad. The survival was not a product of the 6 weeks of training he had received near Chelyabinsk, but of luck whose operation he could observe without understanding. The mathematics of probability that permitted some men to live through circumstances that killed the men beside them. He arrived at the city in December 1942, was assigned to a unit whose previous members had been killed or wounded in fighting whose intensity exceeded anything his training had described, and learned what combat actually required through experience that no abbreviated curriculum could have provided. The lessons cost lives. Some of those lives belonged to men whose deaths taught Abdulin what their deaths had cost him to learn. He fought through the remainder of Stalingrad, through the encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army, through subsequent campaigns whose progression carried Soviet forces westward toward the German frontier and eventually into Germany itself. He was wounded multiple times, recovered in hospitals whose smell of disinfectant and blood became familiar through repetition, returned to units whose composition changed constantly as casualties created vacancies that replacements filled. The war that consumed him for 3 years was a war whose demands his training had not addressed and whose survival required capabilities that experience alone could develop. He wrote his memoir in a Soviet Union that could not acknowledge what inadequate preparation had cost, that could not admit that training measured in weeks had sent millions of men into combat without the skills that survival required. The memoir documented what he had experienced without drawing conclusions whose articulation the system would not have permitted, observations whose implications readers could recognize without authors having to state them. He died on September 16, 2005, in Russia, 87 years old, one of the diminishing number of veterans whose memories preserved what official histories could not record. The 6 weeks that had prepared him for Stalingrad had prepared him for nothing. He had survived anyway, through luck that training could not have provided and experience that training should have anticipated. Eugene Sledge landed on Peleliu in September 1944, 13 months after boot camp had begun the transformation whose completion Peleliu would test. The battle was among the war's most brutal. Japanese defenders fighting from coral ridges whose fortification had been designed to extract maximum casualties from attackers whose eventual victory could not be prevented, but could be made expensive beyond what any rational calculation would have accepted. Sledge's training had prepared him for demands that Peleliu imposed. The operation of the mortar whose rounds he dropped down the tube with precision that weeks of practice had developed. The coordination with squad members whose movements he anticipated because training had made anticipation automatic. The psychological resilience that boot camp stress had installed against the greater stress that combat produced. He survived Peleliu. He survived Okinawa, a battle whose duration and intensity exceeded even what Peleliu had demanded. He returned to the United States in 1946, completed the education that the war had interrupted, earned a doctorate in biology from the University of Florida, and became a professor at the University of Montevallo in Alabama. The memoir he wrote, published in 1981 as With the Old Breed, documented what preparation had meant for the men who received it and what combat had demanded, regardless of how thorough preparation had been. The book became a classic of war literature, its observations preserved for readers whose understanding of the Pacific War would be shaped by Sledge's witness. He died on March 3, 2001 in Montevallo, 77 years old, his memoir still in print, his testimony still teaching. Lesley McNair's grave lies in a military cemetery whose location reflects the honors that his service warranted, a final resting place appropriate for the architect of American military preparation whose methods had produced the army that won in Europe. His training system outlived him, its principles adopted as doctrine by institutions whose peacetime preparation would reflect lessons that wartime necessity had validated. The 8 million soldiers his programs processed became the veterans whose achievements his methods had enabled, men whose survival rates reflected training whose adequacy his insistence on realism had ensured. Two systems had trained soldiers for the same war. One had invested months because soldiers were assets whose protection justified investment. One had invested weeks because soldiers were ammunition whose expenditure was simply operational cost. The training time revealed what each system believed a soldier's life was worth. The men who lived those beliefs had no choice in what the beliefs cost them.